Hello, and welcome to the House Party podcast with Ivory Innovations. I'm Jenna Louie, a director at Ivory Innovations. Our organization is dedicated to catalyzing innovative solutions in housing affordability. This podcast will tap incredible people from our innovations network. We will bring you the top entrepreneurs, researchers, and practitioners in the industry to shine a light on housing affordability solutions. Let's get the party started. We are so excited to welcome Sara Bronin here to the show today. Sara Bronin is a Mexican-American architect, attorney, professor, and policymaker whose interdisciplinary work focuses on how law and policy can foster more equitable, sustainable, well-designed, and connected places. She serves as the 12th chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation after confirmation by unanimous consent of the United States Senate. She is currently on leave from her teaching positions at Cornell, where she has faculty positions at the Cornell College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, the Cornell Law School, and the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. Sara, it is wonderful to have you with us here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Jenna.
Fantastic. So let's dive right in. One of the things we always like to ask our guests is a little bit about your story. So what made you want to pursue a career in housing as an architect? And how have you kind of entered into your background in law and policy as well?
Well, so I've always been interested in the way that buildings are built and the effect that they have as a group on our experience of place. So I went to architecture school in the hopes of influencing that. But quickly I found out that architects are often constrained by things beyond their control, things like building codes and zoning codes and historic preservation laws that put in writing limitations on the things that architects can actually do. So I decided to do a little bit of graduate work and then law school because I thought that in addition to understanding the design side through architecture school and eventually licensure, it would be really important to understand the legal side, because that has as much, if not more, impact on what actually gets built. So I see both law and architecture as being intricately related, and one influencing the other in a serious way. And so I think my interest really stems from trying to understand how we get the outcomes we get in our communities.
Sara, that is such a fun answer, because I think there are so many people in the housing space who come to that same realization. They say, I'm really interested in planning. I'm really interested in the built environment. But the more you get into it, and it's certainly coming up on our podcast, the more you run into, some of these other disciplines, right? It's not just about what we design. It's definitely also about, well, what can you build based on what's true about policy or what's true about regulations? So just your mention of how you started as an architect and then ended up with a law degree and are now doing policy work as well really makes sense and really fits with what we've seen more broadly in the industry and just how interdisciplinary everything is.
I think it's really important that architects especially become more involved in advocacy. I know that the AIA and National Organization Minority Architects and other groups are encouraging members to do so and providing new pathways for that. And so I'm really strongly supportive of architects lending their voices and their knowledge to policies that have long constrained their practice.
That makes absolute sense. And I think that's a great transition into talking about the National Zoning Atlas, which was one of our Ivory Prize finalists in 2023. And could you tell us a little bit more about, this advocacy work? What is the National Zoning Atlas, and what does it aim to do?
So the National Zoning Atlas is an effort by over 50 institutions around the country at this point, housed at Cornell University, to create a legible, understandable, accessible to the public online compendium of probably 30,000 zoning codes around the country. What it tries to do through a standardized methodology that we developed initially from the Connecticut Zoning Atlas is translate and standardize information about zoning rules, particularly as they relate to housing, and display that online. We consider the National Zoning Atlas a project to digitize, demystify, and democratize zoning codes. And what we mean by that is we want for people to understand these invisible rules that shape their environment. And we think that the National Zoning Atlas provides one way to do that.
How do you compile all of this data? Where do you gather it from? I think the demystifying, democratizing makes absolute sense. And for a lot of people, they say, wow, this might be my first interaction with, this kind of data set. So what is it like putting that together?
We rely on teams from all over the country to fan out across zoning jurisdictions and collect first the zoning code and zoning map, put those together in our online repository, and then dig into them and start figuring out what the zoning code text says, and to assess the maps to translate those into GIS files to which the regulatory characteristics can be tied. And so we do that through GIS files that are tied zoning district by zoning district to a massive spreadsheet that zoning code text analysts create on the back end, and then merge those two together to produce the map. There is a methodology online. It's at zoningatlas.org/how, HOW, so how to create it. And that methodology has been used by, I guess now, hundreds of zoning code and geospatial analysts who have contributed to the atlas. So it's certainly a team effort. We're trying to develop a system where everybody's providing the same kind of information. And that's what we think will help make zoning legible across jurisdictions.
And when you mentioned making zoning legible across jurisdictions, can you give us a sense, and maybe starting with Connecticut, how many different zoning jurisdictions are there in a state? Because I think this is something that is really interesting to consider when we talk about the feasibility of scaling innovation, particularly when it comes to the built environment across different places.
So each state has a different number of jurisdictions that have zoning authority. So each state legislature has passed what's called a state zoning enabling law. Many of these states allow for towns, cities, and villages to have zoning. So that's pretty standard. Other states allow counties to have zoning authority, boroughs, other sub-municipal jurisdictions, and in some cases, including Connecticut, the state legislature has enabled certain private associations to exercise zoning authority. So there's no one answer as to how many, there's no sort of set number from one state to the next as to how many jurisdictions can exercise zoning. But the U.S. Census of Local Governments says that there are about 38,000 or so general purpose local governments around the country. We think not all of them, well, we know not all of them have zoning. So we think about 30,000 of those probably have zoning codes that have been adopted. Because no one has done a survey of that, we actually don't know how right we are. But we're seeing in the 20 states that already have zoning atlas projects underway, that's about the ratio. 75% or so of jurisdictions within any given state have zoning.
I think just to restate what you said, 30,000 different jurisdictions that may have zoning across the country. I mean, the data gathering effort that you are leading is so important here, because when we talk about that scale of innovation and how innovators and entrepreneurs might work across these different places, without that knowledge in a standardized way, it's really hard to make change.
Connecticut only had about 180 jurisdictions. So to pick up on your question about scaling, I think it's important to note that as you look across these 180 different zoning codes, they have a very similar structure and similar characteristics in terms of how, at a very basic level, they regulate land uses, and again, particularly housing. So even though Connecticut's a small state in geographic area, it doesn't have as many jurisdictions as, let's say, Ohio, which has about 2,200. You read a zoning code the same way, whether it's a small town, a big city. or, again, even a rural unincorporated area that might be governed by county zoning. So we are seeing the ability to scale, even though we have communities of different sizes that are encompassed in that 30,000 number. And we have states that do things in some cases slightly differently from a state enabling act perspective.
And so let's turn a little bit to Connecticut and how, the National Zoning Atlas started with one state and then spun into this larger project. And so Desegregate Connecticut is also one of our Ivory Prize finalists. We originally met you, Sarah, last year in 2022. And uh, if you could talk a little bit to us about the success of Desegregate Connecticut in publishing that statewide zoning map and the effect that that had on policy, and then also talk to us a little bit about what it's been like as a thought process in taking what worked really well in one state and scaling that up nationwide. How has that been?
In Connecticut, we found that the zoning atlas was helpful in informing policymaking and new thinking at the state and local levels. And we also saw at the state level reforms in 2021 that the state legislature adopted to change certain aspects of the statewide administration of zoning, including new rules on accessory dwelling units, caps on minimum parking requirements, training for land use commissioners, and other tweaks to local zoning that would enable us to more fairly administer zoning codes around the state.
And tell us about your thought process in working with one state and now scaling nationwide. How did that come about and what has that been like?
So the Connecticut Zoning Atlas was, in a way, the test case for the utility of zoning atlases. And as people around the country, my colleagues in law and architecture and planning, heard about what we were doing, they kept asking me, well, can I do that in my state? How would I start that process? And so we wrote up a methodology, which is called How to Make a Zoning Atlas. And again, it's available at that website that others could use. And as we've onboarded new teams to this national effort that we launched in May 2022, we've continued to revise that how-to guide to help accommodate new situations that people are finding in zoning codes as they really dig into them. So scaling up in part has been it's been a little bit of a back and forth. So we started with the Connecticut model and we have tried to export it, but at the same time, we've refined it in response to conditions that we've seen in other states and in response to issues that others have created. So what's really exciting about this project, as it has grown since May to include Atlas teams in places like Montana and California out west, other New England states. And by the way, we have all 6 New England states actively producing or having produced atlases. States in the Midwest, we have a Missouri team, an Ohio team, an Illinois team, soon to be Indiana, and the South. We have a Georgia team, a Texas team. All of these teams bring something different to the conversation. They have different compositions. Some are universities, some are nonprofits, some are state and regional governmental agencies, and they have different reasons for collecting the data. But what I like to say is that as the project has scaled up, whatever reason people are collecting the data for is really not relevant to the question of whether we need the data and what the data says. The data is the data. It's going to say what it says, no matter what the intent is of the teams that are creating it. So I love that different people are viewing the Atlas projects as the potential to achieve a wide variety of ends. But what is most meaningful to me is that people have picked up on the importance of gathering this information and have taken on these projects and made them their own.
I think the piece about the different ends and the different impacts that these groups and volunteers are hoping to see is really interesting because, of course, at Ivory Innovations, we're highly focused on housing affordability. We're interested in how does data and how do different organizations and solutions affect change when it comes to the housing crisis across the country? How do we produce more housing? How do we enable more people to access it? How do we ensure that we have policy and regulations that really support those kinds of outcomes? And so I know that the data is the data, as you've just mentioned, and I think that's a very smart statement. But when it comes to housing affordability, you've mentioned a couple of things that happened in Connecticut in terms of upzoning or parking minimum reforms and ADUs. What are some of the things that maybe over time you could see taking place when it comes to housing affordability as a result of having some of this data available at a nationwide scale?
As you might have seen, just recently, we published a report with the Urban Institute, which looked at our zoning outcomes in the Connecticut Zoning Atlas at a neighborhood scale and cross-referenced the geospatial files of our atlas against demographic outcomes that we had reviewed from the census. What we found is that single-family zoning correlated very heavily with high incomes, high median property values, and whiteness in population. So although our results show correlation and not causation, I think they represent a good example of how the Zoning Atlas projects can be deployed to help us better understand the links between affordability, zoning, and demographic outcomes across a much wider range of communities in the United States. You can find that report at zoningatlas.org if you look for our publications page.
Wow, I am so excited to read that report because it just seems like, the zoning atlas and the power of that database offers really tangible data and evidence for things that have long been anecdotal. And so I'm thinking about a book called The Color of Law. I'm thinking about other studies that have come out over the last few years saying, there are places in our communities where low-income people have historically more or less been forced to live, right? And these are not always the most desirable places. Maybe there are environmental impacts. Maybe they are subject to climate change. There are reasons that our communities have been shaped the way they have been over time and historically. And to be able to prove that out and to be able to show that at a much larger scale is very exciting. And I think just gives a lot of weight and a lot of teeth to something that people have known anecdotally. The last thing I want to ask is just about, what advice you might give to others. So you've had incredible success working with volunteers to make big change, starting with this volunteer effort in Connecticut and now moving to a national scale. What advice would you give to others who are trying to make big change with a small budget?
I would say that finding other people with the same passion as yours can help both fortify your resolve to make that change, even in the absence of immediately available resources, and can draw others to your effort. So in the case of the Connecticut Zoning Atlas and Desegregate Connecticut, it was great to see so many young people flock to that effort because they were passionate about the topic. Their enthusiasm fueled my enthusiasm, fueled others' enthusiasm, fueled funders' enthusiasm, and it just grew. I guess you would call it a virtual cycle. But I think the passion part is the part that we sometimes miss, and even I miss it sometimes when I'm deep into zoning codes or, reviewing what exactly this particular convoluted provision says. You always have to zoom out to that big picture and say, why am I doing this? And if it's something that you can make other people passionate about and understand the need for, then that feeling, I think, will build upon itself. And so the resource issues, whether it's attracting more volunteers or attracting funding, I think really are all fueled by the passion as you start a project, as you start to want to make change. I would also say, too, that you don't have to wait until you are the world's leading expert on any particular topic. I know that, from my perspective, I've been a professor, I've written about these issues, but certainly I was no expert on GIS. Certainly, when we started on the advocacy at Desegregate Connecticut, I had not studied community organizing, in any great detail. But what I was able to do in all of these cases is learn from others, learn as you go, and deploy that knowledge, recycle it back into the project. So don't wait if you have a project that you're really interested in undertaking, and I would say just go with it. If you're interested in starting your own atlas, our team, centralized at the Cornell University Legal Constructs Lab, is ready to help. That is what we do on a daily basis. We help set up teams, we answer questions, we have info sessions. So if that happens to be the project that you're interested in, ask for help, because we're here and ready to give it.
I can't think of a better call to action for signing off than to say, if you are interested, if you are a young person, if you are more experienced, whatever your background, head to zoningatlas.org if you're curious about the work that Sara and this incredible team of volunteers are leading. And stay tuned for our next podcast. Sara, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jenna.